A single dad was invited to be humiliated until the CEO's daughter changed everything. At 11:47 p.m., Rowan Mercer was supposed to be leaving the Grand Meridian Hotel before his babysitter doubled her fee, but one wrong turn through the service corridor stopped him cold. Outside in the freezing alley behind the richest gala in Manhattan, his boss, Celeste Arden, the untouchable billionaire CEO everyone called the Ice Queen, was slumped against a brick wall, barely conscious, while her own chief financial officer tried to force her into a black SUV. Rowan heard the words that made his blood turn to ice. "Get her to the clinic before Monday's board vote." In that instant, he understood this was not drunken embarrassment. This was a corporate execution. Celeste lifted her head just enough to whisper, "He drugged me." Rowan had every reason to walk away. He was only a mid-level auditor. He had a sick 7-year-old daughter at home, medical bills stacked on his kitchen table, and a job he could not afford to lose. But when Victor Sloan threatened his child, something dangerous woke inside him. Rowan stepped into the alley, pulled out his phone, and bluffed like his life depended on it. 10 minutes later, he was driving the most powerful woman in his company to his tiny apartment in Queens, with no idea that he had just made himself the next target. By sunrise, Celeste woke on his worn-out bed, ready to demand answers until she saw the silver locket hanging around Rowan's daughter's neck. Her face went white. Her hands shook. Then she asked one question that shattered 3 years of lies. "Where did your little girl get that necklace?" And before Rowan could answer, someone began pounding on his front door. Because whoever wanted Celeste erased now knew exactly where she was, and the secret around Nora's neck was worth killing for that night. The first thing Rowan Mercer noticed inside the Grand Meridian Hotel was not the crystal chandeliers, not the 10-foot floral arrangements, and not even the orchestra playing beneath the gold leaf ceiling. It was the price of one glass of champagne. $28. Rowan saw the number printed on the small menu card near the bar and almost laughed because $28 was exactly what he had left in his checking account until payday, and payday was still 4 days away. Around him, Manhattan's most powerful people floated through the ballroom in silk gowns, tailored tuxedos, diamond watches, and smiles so polished they looked practiced in mirrors. They spoke about private schools, summer homes, offshore investments, and charity pledges large enough to erase Rowan's entire medical debt twice over. But Rowan stood near the edge of the room in a thrift store tuxedo that pulled too tightly at the shoulders, pretending to sip sparkling water while silently calculating whether he could stretch 1 tank of gas through the week. At 33, he was a senior auditor at Arden Freight Group, a title that sounded more impressive than his life actually was. He spent his days examining numbers inside glass conference rooms, and his nights washing inhaler spacers, folding tiny sweaters, and watching his 7-year-old daughter Nora sleep with one hand resting over the silver locket she never took off. Nora's asthma had been bad since infancy, but the last 3 years had been merciless. Emergency room specialists, insurance denials, medication changes, late-night panic, and bills that arrived with colder language than any doctor had ever used. Rowan had once believed hardship came in waves, but lately it felt more like weather, constant and gray, pressing down on the roof of his small Queens apartment. His ex-wife, Maren Holt, had vanished 3 years earlier, leaving behind a note that said she could not handle the pressure anymore. Rowan had read that note so many times the paper had softened at the folds. He had hated her for it. He had loved her for years before that. Some nights he did both at once. Tonight, however, he had no room left for old grief. He only needed to survive the gala, show his face long enough that no one could accuse him of being absent, then slip away before Mrs. Elspeth Keene, Nora's babysitter, started charging double after midnight. Attendance at the annual Arden Charity Gala was not officially mandatory, but in the corporate world, some rules did not need to be written down. Everyone knew who appeared, who donated, who laughed at the right jokes, and who left too early. Rowan checked his watch. 11:38 p.m. If he left within 10 minutes, took the subway instead of a cab, and walked the last 6 blocks, he might make it home before midnight. He set his untouched glass on a passing tray and began moving toward the side exit, keeping his head slightly lowered, careful not to draw attention from directors, vice presidents, or anyone who might wonder why an auditor from the 42nd floor was sneaking out of a room full of donors. That was when he saw Celeste Arden. She stood near the far end of the ballroom beneath a curtain of warm light, wearing a deep green gown that made her look less like a guest and more like the owner of the air itself. At 36, Celeste was the CEO of Arden Freight Group, daughter of the late Conrad Arden, and the woman employees whispered about with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some called her brilliant, some called her ruthless. Most called her the Ice Queen, though never close enough for her to hear. Rowan had seen her only a handful of times in person, always from a distance, always composed, always moving with the clean precision of someone who had never once needed to ask permission to enter a room. But tonight, something was wrong. Celeste's face was pale. Her lips barely moved as Victor Sloan, the company's chief financial officer, leaned toward her and spoke with a smile too tight to be friendly. Rowan slowed without meaning to. Victor was handsome in the way expensive things were handsome, all sharp lines and polished surfaces. But there was something about him Rowan had never trusted. In audit meetings, Victor answered questions before they were fully asked and smiled hardest when the numbers deserved no smile at all. Rowan had flagged irregularities twice in subsidiary accounts connected to Victor's department, and both times the concerns had been quietly buried by someone above him. Now Victor touched Celeste's elbow. She pulled away, but not with force. Her movement was slow, almost delayed, as if her body had received the command too late. Rowan's attention sharpened. He knew fatigue, he knew alcohol, he knew fear. What he saw in Celeste's unsteady posture looked like none of those things alone. She turned from Victor and moved toward a service hallway near the kitchens, one hand grazing the wall for balance. Victor watched her go for 3 seconds, then nodded to a large man in a black suit Rowan did not recognize. The man followed. So did Victor. Rowan's first instinct was to keep walking toward the exit. It was none of his business. Powerful people had powerful problems, and men like Rowan did not survive by inserting themselves into them. He had Nora to think about. Nora, who would be asleep on the pull-out couch with her yellow inhaler on the crate beside her. Nora, who asked every few weeks whether her mother still remembered her birthday. Nora, whose hospital bills were the reason Rowan could not afford moral heroics. He took 2 steps toward the lobby. Then Celeste's hand slipping against the wall replayed in his mind. The way Victor had nodded. The stranger's hard, watchful face. Rowan cursed under his breath and turned toward the service corridor. The hallway behind the ballroom was narrow and bright-smelling of lemon cleaner roasted meat and hot metal from the kitchen. Waiters moved quickly with trays balanced on their palms, too busy to notice Rowan walking with a false confidence he did not feel. At the end of the corridor, a steel door stood slightly open to the loading area. Cold November air pushed through the gap. Rowan heard voices outside. Low voices. Angry voices. He stepped closer and saw them through the crack. Celeste was slumped against the brick wall of the alley, her green gown dark against the wet pavement, her head tilted as if it had become too heavy for her neck. Victor stood in front of her, no longer smiling. Beside him, the large man gripped the open door of a black SUV idling near the dumpsters. "Get her inside before someone comes looking," Victor hissed. "Monday is too close for her to ruin this now." Celeste tried to lift her hand. "You put something in my drink," she whispered, her voice broken, stripped of every trace of command. "I know what you did to the merger file." Victor's expression hardened. "You are confused, Celeste. You have been unstable since your father died. Everyone has seen it." The large man stepped forward. "Private clinic," he asked. "Upstate," Victor said. "No press, no police, no board appearance. By Monday morning, she will be medically unfit, and the company will finally have adult leadership again." Rowan felt the blood drain from his face. He understood enough. The board vote scheduled for Monday, the rumors of a leadership challenge, the strange account movements he had seen and been told to ignore. This was not a drunken CEO being helped away from a party. This was a kidnapping dressed in corporate language. His phone was in his pocket. His body felt strangely calm, the way it had years ago in uniform when danger became too immediate for panic. But then Victor said something that froze him in place. If she resists, make it look like she collapsed. The board only needs a reason. Celeste's eyes opened halfway, unfocused but terrified. For one impossible second, Rowan and Celeste looked directly at each other through the gap in the door. She saw him. He knew she saw him. And in that look, there was no order, no pride, no ice queen. There was only a silent plea from a woman who knew no one was coming. Rowan thought of his job. He thought of the rent. He thought of Nora's medicine. He thought of Marin walking out the door 3 years ago and leaving him to become the kind of man who could not afford to care. Then Victor reached for Celeste's arm, and Rowan pushed the steel door open. "Ms. Arden," he called loudly, stepping into the alley with his phone already raised. "There you are. Your car is waiting out front. I've been looking everywhere for you." Victor Sloan turned so sharply that the alley light caught the anger in his eyes before he had time to hide it. For one breath, no one moved. The black SUV idled beside the dumpsters, its engine growling softly beneath the cold November drizzle, while Celeste Arden sagged against the brick wall as if the entire weight of her empire had been pressed down onto her shoulders. Rowan Mercer kept his phone raised, forcing his hand not to shake. He knew exactly how absurd he looked in that moment. A struggling auditor in a borrowed-looking tuxedo, standing between the CEO of a billion-dollar company and the man who could destroy his career with one phone call. But he also knew something Victor did not. Men like Victor were powerful only when their crimes stayed quiet. Mercer Victor said slowly, his voice low and poisonous, "You are very confused about what you are seeing." Rowan took one step closer to Celeste, keeping enough distance from the large security contractor to avoid being grabbed. "I'm seeing Ms. Arden in medical distress," he said loudly enough for the words to carry toward the service door. "I'm seeing you trying to put her into a private vehicle instead of calling an ambulance. So unless I'm mistaken, I should probably call 911 and let them decide." The big man shifted his weight. Victor's jaw tightened. "She has had too much to drink. This is a private company matter." "Then you won't mind the police confirming that," Rowan replied. Celeste's eyelids fluttered. Her fingers scraped weakly against the brick. "Don't let him," she whispered. "Please." That one word landed harder than any order could have. Please. Rowan had heard Celeste Arden cut executives apart in meetings with nothing but a raised eyebrow. He had seen senior managers leave her office pale and silent. But now the most feared woman at Arden Freight Group was begging a man whose name she barely knew not to leave her in the hands of her own CFO. Victor stepped close enough that Rowan could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "You have a sick child, don't you, Nora? Is it? 7 years old. Asthma. Mount Sinai records emergency treatments unpaid balances. You really want to turn your life into a war you cannot win?" The alley seemed to narrow around Rowan. For a second, fear flashed hot through his chest. Not fear for himself. He had lived with unpaid bills, sleepless nights, hospital alarms, and the slow humiliation of begging insurance representatives to reconsider denials. But Nora was his exposed nerve. Nora was the one place the world could still break him. His first instinct was to lower the phone, apologize, walk away, and tell himself there had been nothing he could do. Then he looked at Celeste again. He saw her fighting to stay upright, fighting not to disappear into that SUV, fighting a battle that money had not protected her from. Suddenly, Rowan understood something he had spent 3 years trying to forget. Survival was not the same as living. He had been so focused on keeping Nora safe, keeping the lights on, keeping his head down, that he had almost become the kind of man who watched evil happen as long as it happened to someone else. Marin's disappearance had hollowed him out. Debt had disciplined him. Fear had made him practical. But Victor's threat did not make Rowan smaller. It woke something old, disciplined, and dangerous inside him. He lowered his voice. "You just made a mistake," Rowan said. "You mentioned my daughter." Victor blinked. Rowan pressed the emergency call screen on his phone but did not dial. "Here is what happens now. Ms. Arden leaves with me. If you touch her, if your man touches me, if that SUV moves 1 inch closer, I start screaming. Not calling. Screaming. Every server in that kitchen, every photographer smoking near the back entrance, every reporter waiting by the valet line will hear that the CEO of Arden Freight Group is being forced into a car by her CFO. Then we can all enjoy the morning headlines together." For 10 seconds, the only sound was rain ticking against metal. The contractor looked at Victor, waiting for an order. Victor stared at Rowan with hatred so controlled, it looked almost calm. Finally, he stepped back. "Take her, then," he said. "Play hero for one night. But Monday is coming, Mercer. When the board removes her, she will be finished. And when I am done with you, no hospital, no bank, no landlord in this city will believe your promises." Rowan did not answer. He moved to Celeste and caught her just as her knees gave out. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe adrenaline had made him stronger. Victor watched from beside the SUV as Rowan half-carried her down the alley. Every step felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. He did not take her to the lobby, and he did not call a company driver. Celeste gripped his sleeve with surprising force and whispered, "Not my penthouse. Security is his." That was all Rowan needed to hear. He got her into his old Honda Civic 3 blocks away, buckled her seatbelt, turned the heat as high as it would go, and drove toward Queens with his eyes moving constantly between the road and the rearview mirror. By the time they crossed the bridge, Celeste was unconscious. Rowan's mind raced through consequences, termination lawsuits, police reports twisted against him, Nora dragged into danger. Yet beneath the fear, another thought began to form. Victor was not simply trying to embarrass Celeste. He was trying to remove her before the board vote. That meant the numbers Rowan had seen, the buried discrepancies, the subsidiary accounts no one wanted him to question, were not mistakes. They were part of something larger. When he reached his apartment, Mrs. Elspeth Keene was asleep in the armchair with the television flickering blue across the walls. Rowan paid her with the last cash in his wallet and gave a weak excuse about helping a sick colleague. Mrs. Keene glanced at Celeste's ruined gown, then at Rowan's face, and wisely asked nothing. Rowan laid Celeste on the only bed, removed her heels, placed water beside her, and locked the bedroom door from the outside only after making sure the window opened in case they needed to escape. Then he checked on Nora, who slept curled beneath a faded blanket, her silver locket resting against her sweater. Rowan knelt beside her and brushed a curl from her forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he was not sure whether he was apologizing for risking too much or for almost becoming a coward. He did not sleep so much as drift in and out of dread until morning light cut through the blinds. At 7, he was making frozen waffles when the bedroom door opened. Celeste stood there barefoot, pale and furious, in the way wounded people were furious when they realized they had been helpless. "Where am I?" she demanded. "Queens," Rowan said. "My apartment. You told me not to take you home." Her memories returned in visible fragments. The gala, the champagne, Victor, the SUV, the alley. Her face hardened. "The board vote is tomorrow. If he proves I vanished in a compromised state, he can trigger the stability clause." "Then we stop him," Rowan said. The word surprised even him. Celeste stared as if she had expected fear excuses retreat. Rowan set the coffee down. "I'm an auditor. If Victor is moving against you this boldly, there is a financial trail somewhere. Men like him don't just grab power. They document it, hide it, bill it, move it through accounts they think no one will check." For the first time, Celeste truly looked at him not as a disposable employee, but as a man with a mind she might need. Before she could answer, Nora shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy," she murmured, "who's the pretty lady?" Celeste's expression softened for half a second. Then her gaze dropped to the silver locket on Nora's chest. The change was instant. Blood drained from her face. Her hand trembled so violently that the coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor. Rowan stepped in front of Nora. "What is it?" Celeste did not seem to hear him. She sank slowly to her knees, staring at the necklace as if it were a ghost. "Where did your daughter get that?" she whispered. Rowan's stomach tightened. "Her mother gave it to her before she left us." Celeste looked up, tears shining in eyes that had seemed incapable of them. "That locket was buried with my brother 4 years ago." The apartment went silent. Then came the first violent pound against the front door, hard enough to shake dust from the frame, and Rowan realized the war had already found his home. The second pound against the door was louder than the first. A brutal metallic crash that made Nora scream and sent Celeste staggering back from the broken coffee mug on the kitchen floor. For one terrible moment, Rowan Mercer stood frozen between the trembling child behind him and the woman on her knees, staring at the silver locket, as if it had dragged a dead man back into the room. Then the third hit came splitting the cheap wood around the lock, and every part of Rowan that had been buried beneath years of bills, grief, and office silence snapped awake. "Nora, backpack," he said, his voice suddenly calm, almost cold. His daughter, sobbing but trained by years of hospital emergencies to obey when her father used that tone, grabbed the yellow canvas bag beside the couch. Rowan snatched his keys, wallet, and the heavy steel flashlight from the drawer. Celeste rose unsteadily, still pale from the revelation, but her eyes had cleared. "Victor found us," she whispered. "He tracked your car." "Then we don't use the car," Rowan said. The doorframe groaned again. He shoved Celeste and Nora toward the bedroom. "Fire escape! Now!" Celeste looked at the child, then at the narrow window, then hiked up the ruined hem of her gown without a single complaint. In that instant, Rowan saw the first real fracture in the Ice Queen myth. Celeste Arden might have been born into boardrooms and private elevators, but fear had burned away her pride, leaving something sharper underneath survival. She climbed through the window onto the rusted fire escape and reached back for Nora. "Come to me, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentler than Rowan had ever imagined it could be. Nora hesitated only once before letting Celeste lift her into the cold, gray morning. The front door exploded inward just as Rowan slammed the bedroom door shut behind them. 2 men in dark windbreakers stormed into the apartment, one shouting his name, the other sweeping the living room like he expected a fugitive instead of a father's toys and unpaid bills. Rowan jammed the flashlight into the window track, forcing the frame down so it could not be opened from inside, then climbed out after Celeste and Nora. Glass shattered behind him. A hand punched through the window. Rowan kicked backward hard, heard a man curse, and pulled Nora down the iron stairs through the freezing drizzle. They hit the alley running. Every breath burned. Celeste was barefoot, her expensive gown soaked at the hem, but she did not slow down. Rowan led them away from the street where his Honda was parked and cut through the service entrance of a 24-hour diner 2 blocks over. The place smelled of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and wet coats. A waitress shouted as they slipped past the restrooms, but Rowan kept moving, pushing through the rear kitchen door into another alley, then across a loading lane where delivery trucks blocked the view from the main road. Only when they were inside a yellow cab heading toward Newark did Nora finally collapse against Celeste's side, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Celeste wrapped both arms around the little girl with fierce protectiveness. One hand pressed over the locket that had started all of it. Rowan watched them in the rearview mirror and felt something inside him twist. Last night, Celeste had been his impossible boss. This morning, she was the only other person in the cab who understood they were being hunted by a man powerful enough to rewrite reality. "Tell me about your wife," Celeste said, her voice low as the city blurred past the rain-streaked windows. Rowan almost corrected her. Ex-wife. The word had become armor, but suddenly it felt too small for what Marin might have done. "Marin worked for Bell and Stroud," he said. "Junior legal assistant. Mostly archive work, executive filings, sealed agreements. 3 years ago, she came home terrified. I found her sitting on the bathroom floor with every light off. She said she opened a file she should never have seen. I asked what was in it, but she just kept saying, "If I tell you, I make it worse." 2 days later, she was gone. Celeste's face tightened. Bell and Stroud handled Arden executive non-disclosures. They also cleaned up internal liability before it ever reached the board. Rowan stared at her. Cleaned up. Paid people to forget what they saw, Celeste said. Buried lawsuits. Reclassified settlements. My father trusted them because Victor recommended them. Nora shifted in her sleep and the locket glinted against her sweater. Celeste swallowed hard. My brother Bennett died 4 years ago. Hit and run. The police claimed there were no witnesses, no usable traffic footage, no recoverable evidence. I never believed it, but my father was grieving, and Victor was beside me every day telling me to accept closure. Victor was your CFO then, Rowan asked. Celeste looked out the window. He was more than that. He was my fiancé. The cab seemed to go silent around Rowan. Your fiancé? Until 3 months after Bennett's funeral, Celeste said. I ended it because something about him felt wrong. I told myself grief had made me suspicious. But that locket was custom-made for Bennett by my mother before she died. I watched the funeral director place it in his casket. If Nora has it, then someone took it before the burial, or the burial was staged around missing evidence. And if Marin had it, she must have found the file connecting Victor to the accident. Rowan pressed his fist against his mouth. 3 years of hatred rose inside him, then collapsed under its own weight. He remembered Marin kissing Nora's forehead the night before she disappeared. He remembered her hands trembling when she fastened the locket around their daughter's neck. He had thought it was guilt. Now he wondered if it had been goodbye. At the airport transit hotel, Celeste used a false name and paid cash Rowan did not ask her to explain. In the cramped room, while Nora watched cartoons with the volume low, Rowan spread everything they knew across the desk. Victor, the SUV, Bennett's death, Marin's file, the locket, the board vote. A necklace proves emotion, he said, slipping back into the logic of numbers because logic was the only thing keeping him from breaking. It doesn't prove a crime. We need transactions, dates people paid, records altered. If Victor covered up a hit and run, he moved money. Celeste nodded slowly. He keeps a private ledger off the main Arden servers. My father once mentioned it during an argument. A backup system in a logistics warehouse in Hackensack under a subsidiary name. Rowan looked up. Do you have access? Biometric access to the building, she said. Not to Victor's encrypted partition. For the first time all morning, Rowan felt something other than fear. I do. Level 4 audit credentials. If his system mirrors company architecture, I can get in. Celeste stared at him, measuring not his status, but his resolve. If we go there and fail, he will accuse you of kidnapping me and stealing proprietary data. Rowan looked at Nora, small and exhausted under the glow of the television. Then he looked at the locket, no longer just a child's keepsake, but a message from a woman he had thought abandoned them. Then we don't fail, he said. By noon, they stood before a windowless concrete warehouse in Hackensack, the sky hanging low and colorless above the industrial park. Celeste opened a side door with her palm scan, and Rowan guided them through sterile corridors toward the server room. The air inside was freezing, filled with the relentless hum of machines. He sat at the terminal and typed with a focus that pushed the danger to the edges of his mind. Password shells, archive mirrors, hidden partitions, dummy invoices. Victor had built a maze, but he had built it like an executive, not like an auditor. Rowan followed the money. 10 minutes later, the screen filled with transfers, Cayman accounts, police charities, witness payments, legal retainers, forged medical evaluations, prepared for Celeste before she had ever been drugged. Then Rowan found the GPS logs. The black SUV had been at Bennett Arden's accident site. His breath caught as another file opened. Monthly payments to a blind trust in Portland initiated the week Marin vanished. She's alive, he whispered. Celeste leaned over his shoulder. Marin Rowan nodded, his eyes burning. Before either of them could move, the servers flashed red. A shrieking alarm tore through the room. On the monitor, one sentence appeared in white letters. Unauthorized extraction detected. Celeste went still. Victor knows. Rowan ripped the drive from the port, grabbed Nora's hand and ran, realizing the truth had finally surfaced, but so had the cost of proving it. The alarm swallowed the server room in red light, and for one split second, Rowan Mercer felt the old version of himself clawing back to the surface. The man who wanted to apologize, surrender the flash drive, beg for mercy, and protect his daughter by making himself small again. But then Nora's small hand tightened around his fingers, and the weight of the silver locket against her chest reminded him that silence had already cost his family 3 years. "Move," he said, and this time his voice did not shake. Celeste Arden led them through the freezing corridor with the ruthless certainty of someone who had spent her whole life memorizing exits, weaknesses, and power structures. Behind them, metal doors began locking one by one. Somewhere deeper in the warehouse, boots pounded against concrete. Victor had not sent lawyers this time. He had sent men who did not need signatures. Rowan pulled Nora into his arms as Celeste slapped her palm against an emergency panel. The first door refused her scan. Access revoked. Celeste stared at the screen, and Rowan saw the flicker of humiliation cross her face. Her own company, her own building, her own name, and Victor had already begun erasing her from the system. "He's locking me out," she whispered. "Then we stop asking permission," Rowan said. He smashed the glass of the emergency release with the steel flashlight he had carried from his apartment, yanked the lever, and the service door groaned open into a loading bay filled with parked freight trucks. They ran through the smell of diesel and wet cardboard, while 2 guards shouted behind them. A black SUV screeched around the corner of the bay, blocking the main exit. For an instant, Rowan saw the shape of every nightmare in that vehicle. The one that had cornered Celeste, the one that had killed Bennett, the one that might have taken Marin away. Instead of freezing, he grabbed Celeste's wrist and pulled her behind a row of stacked pallets. "There," he said, pointing to a delivery truck idling near the far dock, its rear door half open. The driver was nowhere in sight. "Can you drive that?" Celeste asked, breathless. Rowan almost laughed despite the terror. "I used to drive transport vehicles in worse places than New Jersey." He lifted Nora into the passenger seat, shoved Celeste in after her, and climbed behind the wheel just as the guards rounded the pallets. The truck lurched forward, clipped a stack of plastic crates, and burst out of the loading bay into the industrial park. In the side mirror, Rowan saw the SUV follow. Celeste pulled Nora down against her lap and braced herself against the dashboard. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "Not the police station," Rowan said. "Victor will have someone watching the nearest precinct. We need someone he can't buy before Monday." Celeste understood instantly. Federal. Rowan nodded. SEC first, then homicide. The chase did not last long, but it aged him by years. The delivery truck was too slow to outrun the SUV, so Rowan used what the city gave him: a construction detour, 2 garbage trucks, and a narrow underpass too low for the SUV's roof rack. By the time he abandoned the truck near a train station and led Celeste and Nora into the crowd, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. They changed cabs twice, then took a commuter train back toward Manhattan under names that were not theirs. Nora slept against Celeste again, exhausted beyond fear. Rowan watched the billionaire CEO hold his daughter with both arms, one hand gently rubbing circles between Nora's shoulders, the way he did during asthma attacks. Celeste noticed him watching and looked away first, but not before he saw tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. "Bennett used to sleep like that," she said quietly. "Anywhere. In cars, in airports, under conference tables when my father dragged us to late meetings. He trusted the world too much." Rowan looked at the flash drive hidden inside Nora's backpack. "Marin trusted me too little," he said, then immediately hated how bitter it sounded. Celeste shook her head. "Maybe she trusted you enough to leave the only clue with your daughter." The words struck him harder than comfort should. For 3 years, Rowan had built his survival around a wound. Maren abandoned us. Maren chose herself. Maren could not handle Nora's illness. That story had hurt, but it had also given him a shape for his anger. Now the truth was worse and kinder at the same time. Maren had left because she had seen something monstrous, and instead of dragging danger home, she had walked into exile with everyone believing the worst of her. Rowan pressed his knuckles to his mouth and turned toward the train window. The city blurred past gray and indifferent. "I taught Nora not to ask about her," he whispered. "Every time she missed her mother, I let her think Maren didn't want us." Celeste's voice softened. "You were surviving with the information you had. That doesn't make it right." "No," Celeste said after a pause, "but it means you can still choose what to do next." It was the first time Rowan understood that Celeste was not only talking about Maren, she was talking about herself. For years, she had ruled Arden Freight Group like a fortress because everyone she loved had either died, lied, or tried to use her grief as leverage. She had mistaken control for safety, cruelty for strength, isolation for discipline. Now, barefoot in a borrowed coat, holding a sleeping child in a train car that smelled of damp wool and metal, she looked less like a queen losing a kingdom and more like a woman realizing the kingdom had been poisoned long before she inherited it. At a small federal office downtown, Celeste used one remaining contact her father had trusted, an investigator named Malcolm Reeve, a quiet man with tired eyes and no patience for corporate theater. He did not smile when Celeste introduced herself. He did not look impressed by her name. He simply took the flash drive, listened as Rowan explained the hidden ledgers, the GPS logs, the forged medical evaluations, the payments to the Portland Blind Trust, and the connection to Bennett Arden's hit and run. Rowan expected to stumble, but once he began speaking in numbers, the fear receded. He mapped Victor's crimes with dates, accounts, routing codes, shell companies, and audit logic so clearly that even Celeste turned to look at him with new respect. This was not the man who had hidden at the edge of the gala hoping no one noticed him. This was a man standing inside the truth and refusing to move. Malcolm made 2 copies of the drive, sealed them into evidence bags, and called a homicide detective connected to Bennett's original case. "If this is real," he said, "Monday's board vote becomes a trap." Celeste's eyes sharpened. For Victor, Malcolm confirmed. "But you both need to understand the cost. He will accuse Mr. Mercer of kidnapping, theft, fraud, anything that muddies the evidence. He may also use the child to pressure you." Rowan's stomach clenched, but he did not look away. "Then put Nora somewhere safe," Celeste immediately said. "My private security team has one unit Victor never touched. My father's old driver runs it off book. They can protect her." Rowan hesitated. Trusting anyone connected to Celeste felt dangerous, but Nora woke just then and looked at him with red, tired eyes. "Daddy, are we going to find Mommy?" The room went silent. Rowan knelt in front of her, guilt rising like a tide. He wanted to promise everything. He wanted to say, "Yes, tonight, now she's alive, she loves you, none of this was your fault." But fatherhood had taught him that love without truth could still wound. "We're going to try," he said, his voice breaking. "And I need to tell you something, baby. I was wrong about your mom. I thought she left because she stopped loving us. I don't think that anymore." Nora touched the locket. "So she might have been protecting us." Rowan closed his eyes for half a second. "Yes." Celeste looked away, giving them privacy, but Rowan saw her wipe one tear from her cheek. That evening, in a secure apartment overlooking the East River, Rowan finally allowed himself to sit. Nora slept in the next room under guard. Celeste stood by the window in borrowed clothes, watching the city lights tremble on the water. "Tomorrow I walk into that boardroom," she said. "Victor will be waiting to bury me." Rowan rose beside her, no longer feeling like an employee in the presence of a CEO. "Then we let him start digging," he said. "And when he thinks the grave is yours, we show them what he buried." Celeste turned to him, and the coldness that once defined her was gone, replaced by grief, fear, and something stronger than both. "Why are you still here, Rowan?" she asked. He thought of Nora. He thought of Marin. He thought of Bennett, a dead brother whose Locket had crossed through darkness to find the living. "Because I walked away from too many questions for 3 years," he said. "I'm not walking away from the answers." For the first time, Celeste reached for his hand, not as a boss, not as a billionaire, but as a woman afraid of the morning and determined to face it anyway. Rowan took it. Outside, Manhattan glittered like nothing terrible had ever happened there. Inside, 2 broken lives quietly prepared to confront the man who had shattered them both. Monday morning arrived with a cold brightness that made Manhattan look clean from a distance, as if the city had not spent the weekend hiding blood beneath polished glass. On the 60th floor of Arden Freight Group, the boardroom had already filled before 9. 12 directors sat around the long mahogany table murmuring behind closed doors, while Victor Sloan stood at the head of the room in a charcoal suit, his expression arranged into sorrow. He looked like a man preparing for a funeral, which was almost funny because the funeral he had planned was Celeste Arden's career reputation and freedom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, lowering his voice with practiced grief. "None of us wanted this day to come. Celeste has been under extraordinary pressure since her father's death. Her behavior at the gala, her disappearance afterward, and her recent instability leave us no responsible choice." A director near the window frowned. "Has anyone spoken to her directly?" Victor sighed as if the question pained him. "Our security team has attempted contact. Given the circumstances, I believe she is being influenced by a disgruntled employee from the audit department. A man with financial problems. A man desperate enough to exploit a vulnerable CEO." He let the accusation settle. Around the table, unease shifted into suspicion. That was Victor's gift. He did not need to prove a lie immediately. He only needed to make the truth sound inconvenient. "I am calling for an emergency vote," he continued. "Under the stability clause, Celeste Arden must be removed as chief executive effective immediately, and I will serve as interim chairman until the company is safe." Several directors reached for their pens. Victor's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. Then the boardroom doors opened. Celeste Arden walked in wearing a white suit so sharp it seemed cut from winter itself. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale but steady, and every step she took erased the broken woman Victor had described. Behind her came Rowan Mercer in his modest dark suit, one hand closed around the silver flash drive. Malcolm Reeve from the SEC entered next, followed by 2 federal agents and a homicide detective carrying an evidence folder. The room froze. Victor's smile died so completely it was like watching a mask fall from a face. "Celeste," he said, recovering too quickly. "Thank God. We were worried sick." Celeste did not look at the chair he had claimed. She walked straight to the head of the table and stood in front of him. "Move." One word. No shouting, no trembling, just command. Victor hesitated, and in that hesitation everyone saw the first crack. He stepped aside. Celeste took her father's old chair, then turned to Rowan. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "please begin." Rowan felt every eye swing toward him. A week ago, he would have shrunk beneath that attention. He would have remembered his overdue rent, Nora's medical bills, Marin's empty side of the bed, and the terrifying fact that men in this room could erase his livelihood before lunch. But something in him had changed. He had spent years believing power belonged only to people with money, titles, security details, and names carved into buildings. Now he knew power could also be a father refusing to abandon a drugged woman in an alley. It could be a child's locket. It could be an old truth carried long enough to survive the dark. Rowan plugged the flash drive into the boardroom system. The screen lit up with spreadsheets, wire transfers, shell company structures, GPS records, forged medical evaluations, and scanned legal settlements. Over the past 4 years, Rowan said, his voice steady, Victor Sloan diverted more than $12 million through subsidiary accounts controlled by Arden Freight Group. These funds were routed through Cayman shell companies and used to pay police intermediaries, private security contractors, legal aides, and witnesses connected to the death of Bennett Arden. A director gasped. Victor snapped, "This is absurd! He stole proprietary data." Rowan clicked once. A map appeared. "This is the GPS log from Mr. Sloan's company-issued black SUV on the night Bennett Arden was killed. The vehicle stopped at the exact location of the hit-and-run for 6 minutes, then drove to a private repair facility funded through an unreported vendor account." The homicide detective stepped forward. "That repair facility has already confirmed records were falsified. We have an active warrant." Victor's face reddened. "You cannot seriously believe this man. He kidnapped Celeste. He has every reason to fabricate evidence." Celeste reached into her jacket pocket and placed Bennett's silver locket on the table. The sound it made was small, but it cut through the boardroom like a verdict. "This was buried with my brother," she said. "Or so I was told. It resurfaced around the neck of Rowan Mercer's daughter because Maren Holt, a legal assistant at Bell and Stroud, found your settlement file and stole the one piece of physical evidence your people failed to destroy." Victor went still. For the first time, fear showed plainly on his face. Rowan clicked again. A final record appeared: monthly payments to a blind trust in Portland, Oregon, tied to a protected identity. "Maren Holt is alive," Rowan said, though saying it aloud nearly broke him. "You forced her to disappear by threatening her husband and child. You paid her to stay gone, and you let her family believe she had abandoned them." Victor's composure finally shattered. "She should have stayed silent," he hissed, then realized too late that the room had gone silent around him. The federal agent moved first. Victor lunged toward the laptop, but the detectives caught him before his hand reached the table. He struggled, cursed, demanded lawyers, demanded loyalty, demanded the respect he had stolen from people for years. No one moved to help him. When the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Celeste did not smile. Rowan did not either. Some victories were too heavy for celebration. They only watched as the man who had shattered 2 families was dragged from the room he had planned to conquer. By sunset, the story had broken across every major network. CFO arrested CEO, cleared old hit-and-run, reopened federal fraud probe expanding. But Rowan was not watching the news. He was on a plane to Portland with Nora asleep beside him, her hand wrapped around his sleeve. Celeste had arranged the flight, the protection detail, and the address, but she had not come with him. "This part belongs to your family," she had said at the airport, pressing Bennett's locket gently into Nora's palm. It brought the truth home. "Maybe now it can bring your mother home, too." In Portland, the house was small and gray, tucked behind wet pine trees at the end of a quiet street. Rowan stood at the door for almost a minute before knocking. When it opened, Maren Holt appeared thinner, older, and so full of fear that Rowan understood at once she had not been living. She had only been surviving. Nora whispered, "Mommy." Maren covered her mouth with both hands and collapsed to her knees. The sound she made was not a word. It was 3 years of love, grief, terror, and guilt breaking open at once. Nora ran into her arms. Rowan stood frozen, anger and relief tearing through him in equal measure. Maren looked up through tears. "I thought if I came back he would kill you both." Rowan's voice cracked. "I hated you." She nodded, accepting it like a punishment she had already given herself every day. "I know." He looked at the woman he had lost, the daughter who had never stopped waiting, and the locket that had carried a dead man's truth into a living child's hands. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once. Love did not erase damage. But Rowan stepped forward, knelt beside them, and wrapped his arms around his family because healing had to begin somewhere. Weeks later, Celeste reopened Arden Freight Group under new leadership rules, replacing fear with accountability and silence with truth. Rowan returned not as a forgotten auditor, but as the head of internal integrity, a role built to protect the people no one used to hear. He and Marin rebuilt slowly, honestly, without pretending the missing years had not hurt. Nora grew stronger, not because life became perfect, but because she was no longer surrounded by lies. And Celeste, no longer the Ice Queen, learned that control was not the same as strength. In the end, Rowan's life changed because he chose not to walk away. He saved a woman in an alley, but he also saved the truth about his wife, the memory of Celeste's brother, and the future of his daughter. The story left one clear message behind. Courage can expose corruption, but love is what gives people the strength to rebuild after the truth is finally free.